welcome. Welcome to our fireside chat with Dan. I didn't think there would be flowers here
It's a
between
flower
us.
side chat.
Yeah, it's a flower side chat.
Yeah.
They're from a memorial service. So I remember walking home from Kamala Harris's concession speech. I walked home slowly, and I just looked at this city, and I thought about the life I've lived and this country, and I thought, I feel like I have to really rethink everything I'm doing, and it would be really good to talk to Dan Pink about all of this.
Okay, I'm sorry that your life had reached that much of a low.
And then I just started thinking about how many people's jobs are going to have to change. And if I look down the street that I live on in DC in Brightwood, I think, oh, okay, he's lost his job and she still has hers, and then she lost hers in the next house, and he's going to retire soon, and they're hoping that their house retains its value, and that their assets don't plunge in value, and then the next house and the next house and the next house. And it's just so many people I know are moving, they're having to really rethink what sectors they're going to work in, and so I've had so many heart-to-heart talks, and then even there's a 10-year-old I know, and her parents are really stressed, and she's come to me and asked me for advice, and I realized that the best advice that I give to people goes way back to books that I read 10, 15, 20 years ago. One of the conversations I had with the 10-year-old was about intrinsic motivation. And, it was so helpful to her. And I thought, oh yeah, I read about that in one of Dan's books, and it keeps coming back in other books of his. So for everybody here in the sanctuary and everybody who's joining us online and people who are gonna watch this event afterwards, welcome. And we're so honored to have you here with us, Dan.
I'm so glad to be here. This is my first visit to a Unitarian Universalist church, and we were talking earlier how much I enjoyed the service and found it fascinating.
And I don't know who made the decision about what color to paint this sanctuary, but
I appreciate the tribute. Yeah, I know that the crew was up working late last night.
I'm going to not spend time on Free Agent Nation unless you think there's something
Talk
in that
about whatever you want to talk about. Yeah.
But
good.
In a Whole New Mind.
Yes, that's a book that I wrote. Just to
yeah,
put context,
2004.
Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Jesus. All right.
Yeah, I looked them all up. The future belongs to those who can adapt creatively and harness emotional intelligence. Has the onset of AI changed that?
Okay, so that book, that book laid out, it was 20 years ago, laid out its argument that the skills that used to get you into the middle class were these kind of logical, linear, SAT spreadsheet kinds of abilities that are sort of metaphorically characteristic of the left side of the brain, not like neuroscientifically, but sort of logical, linear, spreadsheet, SAT kinds of abilities. And my argument in that book was that those kinds of abilities were absolutely necessary, but they were no longer sufficient. And a different set of abilities was becoming more important, abilities that were harder to automate, harder to outsource. Things like, as Monica was mentioning, artistry, empathy, symphonic thinking, and so forth. And so I think that's still true in a world of AI. I think that 20 years ago when I wrote that book, there were some things that I wrote that I didn't imagine. I'll give you an example of that. So one of the things that in the book, I wrote about how at the time, software computers could barely recognize a face, could barely distinguish my face from Monica's, and it was clear they were going to be able to do that. But there would be, it was going to be very difficult for software to recognize the emotion that was expressed in somebody's face. That's not true anymore. They can do that pretty well. If you think about things like writing a sonnet or writing a piece of music, I was arguing that it's going to be pretty hard for computers to do that. I don't know about that anymore, And so so there are some things that certainly 20 years ago that I didn't envision in the world. How many of you have actually played around with any of these large language models from ChatGPT to Claude? Yeah. If you haven't, I really would encourage you to do it. I think it's actually really important as a citizen, to understand the world that you experiment with some of these things online. They're extraordinary. They're extraordinary. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. Does anybody remember the first time they sent an email? Okay, and so you had this kind of, I had this sort of Samuel Morse feeling of like the first telegraph message when I sent an email, and it's like, oh my God, and I know who I sent it to. I sent it to my friend Tony Seebach. And I sent an email, and I was like, oh my God, I just put something on my little computer, and it got there instantly to my friend who was living in New York. That's kind of amazing. It's like this could be really useful. And I have the same opinion about the large language models and whatnot. So all of which is to say, to answer Monica's question, is that still true? Yeah, I think it's true. I think it's true-ish. I think a way to think about it in terms of our own work is, what can you do to augment machine intelligence rather than compete with machine intelligence? And so there were certain kinds of things, like if you think about just calculation. Humans can't compete with computers on calculation. You shouldn't, all right? There's not the computer in my watch, the calculator in my watch can do long division faster than any of you, even the best, most ferocious math students here. And so don't compete on long division. And I think if you pull on the string of that, there are certain kinds of things that you don't want to compete with machine intelligence on. That means, I think, that the skills that are going to be necessary are going to be different kinds of things. They're going to be things like taste. Do you have taste? ChatGPT or these large language models can pop out 13 sonnets. Write me a sonnet on the Washington Commanders. And it can pop out 13 of those sonnets. But you have to have the taste to say which one is good and which one isn't, how to direct the computer. So I think it's things like asking questions, having taste, giving people direction, and also certainly the kind of interpersonal skills that are necessary to deal with human beings. But even that, don't sleep on ChatGPT and its interpersonal skills, because there's some interesting studies about these large language models' ability to be emotionally intelligent in their interactions, including some evidence that they're actually better at empathy than certain kinds of than physicians. And if you actually look at forgive me for getting in the weeds here, but if you look at how these large language models are now being used, there's been a change in the last, literally, in the beginning, it was used mostly for kind of creative and generative tasks. I need a slogan for my rutabaga company. Give me 50 slogans for my rutabaga company. Make them rhyme. Don't make them rhyme. Make them 4 words. Don't make them, make them 8 words or whatever, and using that in sort of the generative creativity sense. Today, there's some data that literally 2 weeks ago, there's some data that came out that the biggest use case for these large language models is actually communication, connection. Help me solve this problem. I'm feeling down. What should I do? I need someone to talk to. And so don't sleep on large language models as a form of connection to other human beings as well. So sorry for that long-winded answer, but
That's a great answer. So, you said you're talking about who, artists, inventors, storytellers, and poets.
yeah.
Is there still a need for those people right
Absolutely. And I think that a way to think about this is the fact that you can use a large language model to generate an image doesn't mean there aren't going to be artists. I think that's a foolish claim. In the same way that when photography came along, we still have visual artists. We still have painters. What painting was became something very different. What visual art was became something very different. Photography itself became not only a way to immediately render the real world, but became an art form in itself, with its own grammar, with its own vernacular. And then the pictures started moving, and we had film. And so I actually think that these large language models could be incredible accelerators for a kind of art and a kind of artistry that we haven't seen before. There's no question about that. I think the same thing is true with inventors. The ability to iterate, which is what inventors do, is going to be accelerated by these large language models, is being accelerated by these large language models. And so what else did I have on the list? Poets?
Yes, poets, storytellers, inventors, and
No question
artists.
about it. I actually have been, so let's talk about storytellers. I'll spare you the full dimensions of my midlife crisis here this morning, but one of the things that I've started doing after 20 years of writing books is I've actually started experimenting with writing plays. And I have been writing plays for the stage, and I have been using these large language models sometimes as a sort of like someone to help me out in writing these plays. And saying something, here's a scene. Does this seem plausible to you? Would anybody really say this? Give me 5 things that might happen next. Now, I don't take a lot of it, but it's almost like having another voice. It's almost a long time ago when I was a political speechwriter, I worked in an office, and I worked in a large office, kind of a dodgy office, but it was physically expansive, and there were 2 other guys working in there. And we were just sort of, as a matter of course, saying, hey, what's another word for disappointed? And someone would say, dejected, heartbroken, or it'd say like, hey, is this joke funny? No, that's not funny, but if you change this, and it sort of feel like the large language models are that other person in the office whom you can shout things to and get their reaction from. So I'm generally pretty bullish on what they can do, but the thing is, some people are going to lose their jobs because of this. It seems inevitable, and I don't think in this country we have the systems to make those kinds of transitions easy for people, to put it mildly.
Right, and so then you talked about the 6 senses that increasingly are going to guide our lives and shape our world, being design, story, symphony, empathy, play, and meaning. Yeah. So if you're good at those things, how does that make your skills valuable today?
Well, I mean, again, I think what it means, so if the skills of, I think that the skills of, okay, I'll give you, if I had to add something else, I think that the skill of composition is becoming more and more important in almost everything. When you think about what does a musical composer do? A musical composer puts notes and instruments and things together to form a collective whole. If you think about what a painter does, a painter composes a scene. I think that's true for writers, and I think that the skill of composition, that is, how can you generate certain elements and put them together into something cohesive that hasn't been done before? That to me seems like a fundamental skill. A design sensibility is important, but design sensibility is going to be different in a world of large language models and generative AI, in the same way that being a designer became different when there was computer-aided design. When I was in middle school, we had, which shows you my age. I was in the first cohort in my Central Ohio school district, where this is amazing when you think about this. I was the first cohort. We had home economics, and we had what was called industrial arts, basically shop and home economics. And I was in the first cohort where both genders took those. If you can imagine that. It's like, we can't let girls do wood shop or drafting. We can't let boys into the kitchen. And so in industrial arts, we had like this drafting table with pencils and things like that. I mean, it's almost like prehistoric.
I did that. I was the first girl in drafting.
Yeah, and so, do we still have architects now? Yeah, we do. They're enabled by these other kinds of things. Do we still have designers? Yeah, when they're enabled by these kinds of things. They're doing different things. And the argument that I made in that book was that we're moving from the information age to what I call the conceptual age. And I think that remains pretty true, that a lot of the abilities are these conceptual abilities. They're less abilities about the execution by hand or even the execution by calculation, but by the ability to conceive and make choices and discernment and judgment and those kinds of things. So thanks for mentioning that long-forgotten book.
Well, and then
I think it's relevant today.
I think
people should buy it today.
I think so. And then I recently bought The Adventures of Johnny Bunko, the last career guide I will ever need, 2008, where you taught us there is no plan, and I think that's very relevant to today. Think strengths, not weaknesses. It's not about you.
Yeah.
Persistence trumps talent. Make excellent mistakes. and leave an imprint. What can you tell us about making excellent mistakes in this day and age and how that can aid us in our journey?
There is a certain, you could see it in what did you call the session with where the kids came up here?
Oh, this time for all ages.
Time for all ages, all right? So those kids were not concerned about making mistakes. Those kids, like the Reverend said, Reverend Rob? Yeah, Reverend Rob, asked them to do something and like, tell me to give it back to you. And they're like, give it back to me. They were unhesitating. They were not saying, oh, how do you want me to do it? Am I going to get this right? Am I saying it the right way? They were just like, they're into it. And so I think that a lot of times our fear of, especially people of even modest levels of accomplishment, or any level of accomplishment, end up being more concerned about, there's a certain tipping point where, which you hate to see, where those kids who are not concerned about making mistakes end up becoming more concerned about making mistakes than doing something amazing. And doing something amazing requires you to make mistakes. Now, I think there are two categories of mistakes. There's excellent mistakes and really, really stupid mistakes. So, really stupid mistake is, stupid mistake. Lock your car. Don't, lock your car in certain neighborhoods. So that's not an excellent. Oh, I didn't leave my car locked and my car got broken into. That's an excellent mistake. No, that's a stupid mistake. But if you say I'm going to try a project and the project went south on me, that could be an excellent mistake. You tried something, you learned something.
You can learn why it went south.
You can learn why it went south on you. You built your skills, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is a, we might be able to get to the book about regret, which is the most recent book, but there's a guy in the book who I read about, in the book about the emotion of regret, who said, he's in his 50s, and he said, I never focus on succeeding, I focus on not failing. That was his big regret. Like, my focus was on not failing rather than on succeeding. And I don't think human beings flourish in that environment. We want a little bit of defense, avoiding mistakes, certain kinds of mistakes, but we want some offense too. And I've just used, my wife allows me one sports metaphor a day, so I've just used it up.
Right, since you mentioned the power of regret, how looking back moves us forward 2022, I mean, thank you. I'm so glad I just read that book.
Thanks for reading it.
So how do we optimize our regrets?
Well, I mean, let me take a step back on that one. So if you think about regret, I mean, any of you have any regrets? Okay, yeah, thank you for that response, because one of the things we know about regret, and can I take 2 steps back and just give some context on this book? So I decided to write a book about regret that it was the kind of book that I would not have written 20 years ago. And I don't think I could have written that book in my 30s or even my 40s. But in my late 50s, it felt inevitable that I would write this book about regret, because I had more of my life behind me than ahead of me. And when we look back on our lives, we inevitably see things that we wish we had done. We see things that we wish we hadn't done. We see things that we wish we had done differently. And I found that emotion quite interesting. And it turns out that there's a great deal of social science on this emotion of regret. But I also, for this book, decided to do 2 large research projects of my own. One of them was the American Regret Project, which was a very large public opinion survey about American attitudes on regret. So the largest public opinion survey ever conducted on American attitudes about regret, about which more in a moment. And then I think the most remarkable thing, it became remarkable in ways that I didn't expect, was that I decided to do a project, an online project, to collect regrets from, few regrets from people around the world. And we now have a database. I had to close it off. We now have a database of 26,000 regrets from people in 134 countries. And that became this incredible source of sort of what people regret. So one of the things that you see in So we have 3 buckets of research. So one of the things you see in the first bucket of research, the 60 years of social science on regret, is basically 2 things. Number 1, everybody has regrets. It is one of the most common emotions that human beings have. I mean, here we are, you guys are talking about repentance, right? You guys are talking about repentance. It is one of the most common regrets that people have. And we know that from social science, we know that from cognitive psychology, social psychology, we know from neuroscience, even developmental neuroscience, that the only people who don't have regrets, truly, are 5-year-olds, because their brains can't do the counterfactual thinking necessary for regret. So they haven't developed, literally, their brains are not developed enough to do, because regret is so cognitively complex. You go backward in time. You undo something you did. You come back to the present, and the present is suddenly reconfigured because of this choice you made in an imaginary past. I mean, it's incredibly cognitively complex. 5-year-olds can't do that. People with certain kinds of neurodegenerative disorders can't feel regret because it interrupts their ability to do counterfactual thinking, and sociopaths don't have regrets. So if you're not, I was fortunate that fortunately everybody here raised their hands, because it's a signal to me that no one is 5 years old, has a neurodegenerative disease, or is a sociopath. Right? So everybody has regrets, but it's also, you have to wonder, why would this emotion that's so painful be so ubiquitous? And the answer is because it's useful if we treat it right. And what we haven't been doing is we haven't been treating it right, especially in certain kinds of American traditions, where the indoctrination is the path to a life well lived is to be positive all the time and never be negative, to always look forward and never look back. And that is a bad idea. That is scientifically a bad idea. That regret is an adaptive emotion. And what matters is how we deal with our regrets. And so we can choose to ignore them. We can buy into this relentless positivity and say, we feel that hear that tinge of regret, and we put our fingers in our ears and say, no regrets, everything happens for a reason, got to be positive. That's a really bad idea. Now, what's also a bad idea is wallowing in your regrets, stewing in your regrets, ruminating in your regrets. That's a really bad idea, too. What we should be doing is confronting our regrets, using them as signal, using them as information. And when we do that, there's all kinds of research in social psychology, especially, that it's a very useful emotion. That if you process your regrets better, effectively, you make better choices next time. You're a better problem solver next time. You're a better negotiator next time. You're a better strategist next time. You're able to find more meaning next time. And so you have this emotion that's ubiquitous and painful, yet is adaptive if we treat it right. And so that's what the science says. The second piece of research, the quantitative research, you guys might find this interesting, is that I did a very large sample because of what I wanted to find out in this quantitative sample were demographic differences. Do men have different regrets than women? Do people of color have different regrets than white people? Do people who are large degrees of formal education have different regrets than people with less formal education? And so I did this very, very large sample in order to have enough representation in these demographic groups. And we crunched the numbers, and there weren't very many. I mean, I spent all this time and money, and it's like, I don't have much. One of the things that you see, I'll give you a couple of the highlights from that surprised me. One of them was, does belief in God how does belief in God affect people's propensity for regret, whether they have regrets, what they regret? And there were precisely 0 correlations with that. 0, none, zilch. Part of that is because in an American sample, so many people believe in God. And so, but 0. How about introverts and extroverts? 0. Men and women, close to 0. There are a few modest differences. Racial, a few modest. Education. People with more formal education actually had more career regrets than people with less formal education. Probably because they had more career options and therefore a larger universe of things to regret. The one area, here's the punchline that you've been waiting for. The one demographic difference that I found in this quantitative piece of research was on age. In the architecture of regret, there are 2 kinds of regret. You can regret actions or inactions. You can regret what you did, or you can regret what you didn't do. People in their 20s tended to have equal numbers of regrets, but your church is about the only place where I think it would be appropriate to have like a chart, and so, because you're drawing from all faith traditions, including data. If you draw a chart, all right, people in their 20s had equal numbers of regrets of action and inaction. People in their 30s had a few more regrets of inaction than action. People in their 40s had a lot more regrets of inaction than action. And what you see is that as people age, it's not even close. And basically, by the time you hit your late 30s or 40s, the regrets of, even late 30s, the regrets of inaction take over. When you get to my age, all right, and I'm in my mid-50s, which means I turned 60 last year. When you get to like 50s, and then well beyond, it's not even close. People, as they age, have way more regrets about inaction than about action. I mean, it was like the most powerful, it was basically the single biggest, by far the biggest demographic difference in this quantitative research, and it's very consistent with research, the existing research showing that what sticks with people over time are regrets of inaction over regrets of action. What haunts people over time are regrets of inaction over action. We sometimes will make sense of our regrets of action. We contextualize them. We find a silver lining. I shouldn't have, I married the wrong partner. I found the wrong partner. That was a big mistake. I regret that, but at least we have these two great kids, right? So people find that. You see it but you also can you had it here today. You had it from Maimonides. You had it here. How do you, for regrets of action, you can make amends. You can name it. I mean, it's Maimonides. You can name. I was raised in a Jewish tradition, so I'm like feeling at home, here. What did Maimonides say? You name the offense that you did. You start to change. You make restitution. You apologize. You vow to do better next time. I mean, so you can make sense of these regrets of action, but if you don't do something, if you don't take a chance, if you don't say to somebody something that you've been wanting to say, if you don't speak up, it sticks with you, it haunts you, it gnaws at you over and over and over and over again.
So bringing it to the here and now, Dan, there's a lot going on that some of us are afraid to talk about and speak up about, right? How do you tie that to what's happening just down 16th Street?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give a glib answer, but I think you do speak up, and I'll tell you why I think that. This third batch of material that we have on regret is these 26,000 regrets from people all over the world. And it turns out there are 4 core regrets that people express all over the world. But if you go into that database and you start looking for phrases, and you search for phrases, speak up, spoken up, speaking up, it comes up a lot, much more than I would have expected. Much more than I would have expected. So people do have regrets about not speaking up. And I think a lot of the times we imagine ourselves back into the past. We're in the era of slavery. Well, of course, I would have been one of the people who was, ardent abolitionist and leading the charge. We're in the McCarthy era. Oh, of course, I would have been one of the people, standing up against the HUAC committee and da-da-da-da. And we imagine ourselves into the past and say, well, of course, I would have been one of those people. Well, we're in one of those times. and future you, and the point is that future you is going to be looking back on current you saying, what did you do? And so I think it's a good decision-making tool to imagine yourself into the future. Again, our brains are amazing. Time travel, we can time travel. We can travel in the past, we can travel to the future. It's a very powerful tool. And so imagine yourself, imagine that you have to have a conversation with you. Imagine you're on a Zoom call with the you of 2035 or the you of 2045. I'm on a Zoom call with the me of 2035. All right? So imagine yourself 10 years into the future and think about how old you'll be. All right? I'll obviously be in my mid-60s. And you know, do you want to have to explain to the you of 10 years from now that you didn't speak up? And what sticks, I think you have to, so that's I don't want to be glib about that. So I think you have to do it in a way that is smart and strategic, and more important is that when we have to give each other the support when they speak up. We can't turn the other way. We can't, we have to give other people the love and the guidance and the support and actually the collective voice to speak up. And so I think that's, there is no question in my mind that we are in one of those moments. And I think that saying, oh no, it's not that. We are in one of those moments right now. And the question is, like, what, how do you speak up? My wife and I went down to the protest, 2 weeks ago? And again, I don't want to present this as anywhere close to any kind of profile in courage, but we went down there. I posted a bunch of photos on social media where I have some number of followers, and I got some hate. No question about it. I got some hate. But you know what? That's not like losing your job. That's not like being a judge in Milwaukee and being carted off to prison. That's not like being sent to a El Salvador prison, And so there are other people who cheered you on. So when you speak up, you have to, I think we have an obligation to speak up, but we also have an obligation to cheer on and support others who are speaking up. And not to silently say, oh, I'm so glad they're doing that, that means I don't have to.
In 2012, you published To Sell is Human.
Yeah, so sorry to get political on you, because I know that would never happen within these walls.
I took it there. To Sell is Human, you talk about how to move other people. We're selling people not necessarily a widget, but influencing people. So now is the time, and I was with Ukrainian delegations, third anniversary of the full-scale invasion of the war. Ukrainian Americans had descended upon DC, and we were talking about the people who have power right now in Congress are in red states. And what do we say to them? Well, we talk about how people in occupied territories are being tortured for their religious beliefs, because that resonates with their constituents, and what jobs are going away because we're not sending munitions to the war in each district and everything. So what about attunement, buoyancy, clarity can we use to help us influence and move things in a direction that our consciences are going to be happier with 10 years from now?
I think if you look at, I think it's if you think about one of the things we humans don't do well, and I'm going to put a finer point on it, one of the things that people left of center don't do very well is actually deeply trying to understand and take seriously the positions of people who disagree with them, and actually really thinking about those positions and understanding those positions, and even being able to make those arguments and make those cases, right? Like first of all, honoring the positions as legitimate positions and being able to make that case. That's a hard thing to do, because many of the positions, I have a hard time to do this because I think that some of the positions are actually not legitimate. But being able to make the other side's case, being able to imagine yourself into their head, take their perspective, is really a killer app. This is the trait of attunement. In being able to persuade or move anybody, is being able to see the world from their point of view and find common ground. So what you're talking about is attunement. So if you have, say, a red district, and you're talking about, Gaza or something like that, people being persecuted for their religious beliefs is a better argument than, freeing oppressed people in a general sense. But I think it's really, really important to be able to take the other side's position. Can you make their case? You don't have to agree with it, but can you make your case? And when you understand that case, you're going to be a better job of persuading others. And there is actually some evidence in social science that, how many of you have read the book The Righteous Mind by John Haidt? Okay, this is a very important book to read for understanding sort of politics and morality in America. And essentially, what it says is that, well, it says a lot of very fascinating things, but one of the things that it says is that when you look at people's morality, there are different components of morality. And left of center, the components of morality are basically don't harm other people. Whereas right of center, that includes those kinds of things, but it also includes things like sanctity, purity, respect for authority, and whatnot. And so understanding where the other side's morality comes from is actually extremely important in just, I think, being a good citizen, but also getting your way.
Yeah, loyalty is important.
Loyalty, right? There's there are multiple. I'm trying to remember what they are. It's like there's a respect for authority. There is a respect for sanctity and purity in a way that people left of center often don't admire. And I'm not saying one isn't right or one isn't wrong. You just have to understand that. You have to understand that. And you see a little. I'll give you another book recommendation, which is a book called, not a great title, but a great book. Its book is called Rule Breakers, Rule Makers, and it's a book by Michelle Gelfand at Stanford, and it looks at. It's cross-cultural psychology, and what it says is that certain cultures are tight, and some cultures are tight, some cultures are loose. And when I say culture can be in a national culture, it can be in a family culture, it can be an organizational culture. So you go to Germany, and public clocks are accurate. You go to Brazil, maybe not. All right? You go to some kind of cultures, some kind of organizations, everything starts on time. You go to other places, it doesn't start on time. You have some families where, like when my kids were little, there were some families where the kids always call me Mr. Pink. And there are other families where the kids always call me Dan. And there wasn't right or wrong, it's just like they're different, and so understanding, and so I think that those kinds of things, really taking seriously people who disagree with you, taking them very seriously, imagining yourself into their world, and actually being able to take their position is, I think, really, really important politically in advancing the cause.
So they can hear us.
Absolutely.
That's the beginning.
Absolutely right.
So I know there are some people in this room right now who have lost their jobs,
Yeah.
and they have to reinvent themselves. Yeah. Their sector is gone. And they, what they studied in school was they wanted to make the world a better place. And, what advice do you have for them in finding purpose in work in completely different areas? What are some good ways to explore those things?
I mean, this is actually really hard. Okay, so I don't want to sugarcoat it at all. It's actually really, really hard because what's going on is more complex than simply finding a job. And so again, I'm trying to push against my instincts, which is to reduce everything to either science or sports. And so, but there is science on this, and that there's Ermini Ibarra at London Business School has done a lot of work on these kinds of transitions. And one of the things that makes them difficult is that it's not a purely kind of transactional thing. I lost my job, I'm going to find a new job. That's very transactional. What often happens is that I've lost my job and I'm actually reworking my identity. Who am I? And our instinct in doing these kinds of transitions is to be very, transactional isn't the word I'm looking for. You almost want to be, our instinct is to be sort of MBA-like. That is, okay, I lost my job or I want to switch careers. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to analyze the problem. I'm going to analyze the sector. I'm going to come up with a strategy. I'm going to execute against this strategy. Right? That makes perfect sense. That's not how it works. Because what's happening is that there's such an identity issue here that you have to find a new identity of sorts. And the way we find a new identity is not with a strategic plan, but it's by doing stuff. You do stuff, you experiment. You're finding your way to this new identity, and it's not going to happen immediately. And it's not going to happen immediately, and it's going to feel very uncertain, and it's going to feel very, very frustrating as you find your way to that new identity. But that's what a lot of the research says. I think practically what you want to do is, like I worked for myself for over 25 years, and I still preach, I still live and preach low overhead. I mean it. It's like I cannot, forgive the puritanical thing here, but I cannot overstate the importance of frugality. Just like sort of just sensible frugality, not like austere frugality, but just be frugal. Don't waste your money on stupid things. And then also, but also don't underestimate. Two reasons. Number one, don't underestimate other people's willingness to help you. A lot of times we resist reaching out because we think it's going to be a burden, but people in general, not everybody, are going to be more willing to help than you expect. And so people are going to be more willing to help. The other thing that we see is that the people who are going to be the most helpful to you are often not your tightest connections. There's a lot of good research about how loose ties can be actually more effective in these situations than close ties. And so reach out to a lot of people. Don't assume that they're not, assume that people will be willing to help you a little. And also, there's a numbers game here in these kinds of things. There's a numbers game here. You're just like, someone out there is going to be a pathway to something else, but you don't know whether it's going to be the first person you talk to, or the 14th person you talk to, or the 44th person you talk to. And you got to keep playing, you got to keep doing that over and over again. And also, so anyway, but it's really freaking hard right now. I don't want to overstate that. It's really, really hard.
So some of my friends here have intentionally taken breaks to clear their minds, to learn new things, and some to heal from, for example, long COVID. You wrote a book called When, came out in 2017. What does your research tell us about taking breaks?
Well, if you think about breaks during the day, I just praised the Puritans for frugality. Let me trash the Puritans now, all right? This idea that, the idea that, especially at a day-to-day level, especially at sort of a level of getting stuff done, is that we've swallowed this philosophy that the way to get more and better work done is to power through. Always power through. Don't take breaks. Always power through. And the evidence is completely the opposite. What it shows is that, I felt afraid of this for a long time. I always believed that amateurs took breaks and professionals didn't. And it's the exact opposite. We see this in great athletes, we see this in great musicians. So a way to think about it conceptually is that you have to think of breaks as part of your performance rather than a deviation from your performance. And so we tend to think that when we take a break, it's like a concession, it's a deviation from being serious, when in fact, it's part of what it means to be a professional. And so we have to take breaks seriously. We have to be very, very hard-headed about breaks, particularly during a day or a week. And we know a lot about the elements of restorative breaks. I mean, I'll give you the design principles for an effective break, especially in a day. Is outside is better than inside. A lot of good research about being out, even being able to see nature. Breaks where you're in motion rather than sedentary are more restorative. Believe it or not, breaks with other people are more restorative than breaks on your own, even for introverts. You want to be, something is better than nothing. So a 2-minute break is better than no break at all. And you want to have your break be fully detached. You don't want to be talking about work. You don't want to be on your phone. And so to me, this suggests in part that there's if everybody in America took a 15-minute walk break every afternoon with somebody they liked, talking about something other than work, leaving their phones behind, I think there would be a material increase in GDP. I really do.
Yeah. Okay. group timing.
Ah,
When we're up
choirs.
against,
We were just talking about that.
yeah, when we're up against a huge challenge that we can't take on alone, what should we consider when we're coordinating with others?
A lot of the stuff on coordination shows, you know, do groups work best when there's sort of a clear leader and a hierarchy, or whether they're emergent? And the answer is yes, and it depends. So it's like it's sort of both. There are certain circumstances where having a clear leader and some kind of hierarchy is actually really effective. There are other kinds of things where letting that group cohesion emerge is more effective. So there isn't an easy answer to that. There isn't an easy answer to that. I think that what you want is some kind of modest hierarchy and structure, but you want to Goldilocks it. You don't want too much, and you don't want too little. I mean, it's not helpful operationally on this. You see it a little bit in terms of, again, some research on this is you see it a little bit in terms of the best performing groups. So you think about so let's say you're going to do a project or do anything, a social movement, anything, and you're going to do it with people you've already worked with before, or you can do it with people whom you've never worked with before. And so there's some research actually on Broadway shows on this, because those are things where like a group of people come together, then it disbands, then a different group of people maybe, and so what is the ideal mix there? And so imagine you have a group and you basically just repeat the group and do another project exactly the same. Those are usually not that great. Then you have something where you're working with entirely new people for the first time. Those are often not that great. There seems to be a sweet spot where you're working with some of the people who you worked with before, but then also some new blood. That if you look at the most successful Broadway shows over like decades and decades and decades, it was the mix of some people had worked together before, but they were infused with some new blood. That seems to be the ideal composition of a group. And then in terms of the governance of the group, again, a mix between some hierarchy and then some self-organization. Not super operational, but that's what it says.
Well, that's great. Well, I think it's 1:10, so let's take some questions. Do we have any questions, Lori, on the Zoom chat? Has anybody? If anybody is watching virtually and they have some questions.
No, I'm just waving to the Zoom people.
Oh yeah. Hi.
I'm assuming that's the camera for Zoom. Otherwise, I'm just waving cluelessly into the ether. Oh, that's the camera Zoom? There are 3 cameras here. You're on this one right now. That one. Okay, yeah, that's the one I was waving to. Yeah.
Okay. I guess we won't do the question cards. Do you want to ask a question?
Hi, my name's Miriam.
It's Mary Ellen?
Miriam Sikis, yeah. Thanks so much for being here. I'm really interested about this idea of regret, and I admit that I have not read any of your books, but I do plan to now. So, I worked in the field of peace building, and I find that some of the hardest conversations I've ever tried to open in a personal space or in a professional space have been about regret, because I think they so often come off as confrontational, and especially I think what you're mentioning, the inaction component of like, or even that it was just so long ago that there's a sense that there's really no way to repair the harm, especially the direct harm, right? Today we talked a little bit more about this expansive sense of how you repair, but I've done some work in intergenerational spaces, and I've felt like the one pathway to intergenerational learning that could be so rich is through conversations around regret. But I think they're so hard because part of the regret is not being like, oh, but then thanks to that, I was able to do this. But rather, maybe thanks to that, I had this learning that ended up, but that connection, not being able to necessarily, because it's not so accessible for everybody to make that connection about how there was that positive point, and not having that positive spin is so hard those conversations come off so or become so difficult. So anyway, so I'm interested about how what you've seen or in terms of how to have conversations about regret, especially kind of for this intergenerational learning as we're thinking about, do it because in the future you're going to regret not acting at this moment or whatever that means. So anyways, thanks so much.
I mean, I think, Miriam, a way to do this is to do it at a very personal level, at a kind of a personal level without being aggressively didactic and trusting the people on the other end to draw their own conclusions. And I think that works especially well intergenerationally. So if you have somebody, you can think about it in terms of, you think about, I have 3 kids, you can think about it in terms of parents, all right? So if I were to say to my kids, or any parent were to say to their kids, let me tell you a lesson you need to learn. Shut down, all right? But if you say to, any parent says to their kids, can I tell you about one of the biggest mistakes I made? I think kids are going to be all in. And if you say, and if you do it in a certain way, you say, again, nothing didactic, just simply, here's what, if you say, here's a mistake, here's a regret that I have, right? And you do it tonally so that you're not blithe about it, but you're also not self-flagellating about it. You're just looking it in the eye. Here's a regret that I have. Here's what I learned from it. And here's what I'm going to do about it. And leave it there. Don't say, and therefore, you should. Just let it out there, and just model that. And I think that that process, here's a regret that, and I think it's true for bosses, I think it's true for parents, I think it's true for clergy people, I think it's true for political leaders. Here's a regret that I have. Here's what I learned from it. Here's what I'm going to do about it.
It's a little like that panda this morning, right?
I mean, here's the thing, though, but it's interesting you say that. I mean, my view is that one of the reasons that people have become stymied by regret and weighed down by regret is that they have, that there's been such a divorce from, in America especially, from organized religion, that they don't have the rituals and the mechanisms to make sense of those kinds of regrets. And so many, like here we were talking about repentance. And so you go to think about Catholicism. Catholicism, there's a little place where you say, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. And then you essentially reveal the regret. You do the sense making that comes from talking about something. And there's a ritual for doing with it. Judaism has of course, you guys observed it here. Has a single day, the Day of Atonement, where the whole day is about reflecting on your mistakes. And so, I think in the purely secular world, people are adrift and don't have the ways to do that. But it's actually relatively simple. It is and at an individual level, one of the things that you need to do when you have a regret is treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. A lot of the times when we have a regret, even more broadly, the way we talk to ourselves in the face of mistakes is cruel. If you were to broadcast my self-talk, if I were to take my self-talk, the way I talk to myself sometimes, and I were to do that to somebody else, and if we're in a workplace, HR would come in immediately. I mean, it's like, so the lesson is don't do that. Treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. There's a lot to be said. There's a reason that confessionals are important here. There's a reason that there's a reason that in Catholicism especially, confession is important, because when we talk about something, even when we write about something, we make sense of it. It's not only a lifting of the burden, but a lot of times these negative emotions are amorphous, they're blobby, they hover over us. And so when we write about them or talk about them, we convert that vaporousness into concrete words, and it's less menacing. We make sense of it. And then you want something forward-looking. You want to be able to say, therefore, the next thing I'm going to do when I'm confronted with this again, and then, I think that's how you do it. But in terms of sort of leaders and parents and bosses, just exemplify the behavior you want and give it time for it to sink in.
Hi, my name is Owen. Thank you for being here today. So you gave an overview of the differences between regrets based on inaction and action, and you talked about the groups of people who don't experience regret. And I'm curious about the group of people, if there is a group of people that has few regrets, like very few regrets, either because they were proactive or because they learned how to recognize opportunities. What characteristics define those people?
That's a great question, Owen, and I actually don't. I'm not sure I know the answer to that in the research. I'm not sure it's a group of people. I don't think there's anything about any sort of common group identity that is like. I think that there are individuals who either through instinct or through experience or through good mentors or something are able to process regret in that. Who are able to process regret in that healthy way. They've somehow learned that triangulation that I was talking about, which is not ignoring it, not wallowing it, but confronting it and looking it in the eye. So I don't think there's any, I don't think it's anything about any particular kind of group identity. My hunch, and I don't know this, my hunch is that people who are high on the psychological trait of openness might be more likely to do this, so because they're more open to experience and open to possibility. But that's just a hunch. It's more really kind of a random group of people who have somehow figured out how to do it better. But I don't think there's any evidence that I was in the belief in God question. That's what I was after, to see whether there was any difference in propensity for regret or anything based on belief of God. And at least in my research, there wasn't. I just think it's certain individuals, for whatever reason, have figured out that mechanism of looking in the eye, looking into the eye, not tamping it down, not letting it take over, really kind of thinking about your regret, using it as information. Somehow they figured out how to do that.
And maybe the us of 20 years from now will look at people who used your optimization of regrets and see that if that had an impact.
We could do that. I mean, one of the things that you see is so in this qualitative thing that I did, the 26,000 regrets. What we found is that people seem to have the same 4 regrets all over the world. So one regret was a foundation regret, which is basically. If only I did the work. So these are people who said, I spent too much and saved too little, now I'm broke. Small decisions that accumulate to terrible consequences. I didn't exercise or eat right, now I'm profoundly unhealthy. So no single decision is horrible, but it adds up. Foundation regrets. Another regret, huge category, boldness regrets. I was at a juncture in my life, I had a choice. I could play it safe or take the chance. Play it safe or take the chance. And overwhelmingly people who didn't take the chance regret it. People who took the chance, even when it went south on them, some of those people regretted it, but many of them did not actually, because they took the chance. So, and it could be, you're at a juncture, basically, I have a chance to do something, to be bold or to play it safe. And overwhelmingly, people regret not being bold. And it doesn't matter the domain of life. It could be careers. From the book, I have hundreds of things in this database that go like this. X years ago, there was someone I really liked. I wanted to ask them out on a date, but I was too chicken to do it, and I've regretted it ever since. These are people 20, 30, 40 years later harboring that regret about not asking somebody out on a date. So regrets of boldness. Moral regrets. You're at a juncture in your life. You could do the right thing, you could do the wrong thing. You do the wrong thing, most people, most of the time, regret it. Because most people are good and want to be good. When I say most people, I don't mean like 51%. I mean like 95% of people are good and want to be good and feel crappy when they're not good. And so the moral regrets, huge numbers of regrets about bullying. Even I did about 170 follow-up interviews with people who completed these things. I had a woman breaking into tears, 50-year-old woman break into tears, describing bullying a kid on the bus when she was 9 years old. I had a woman, I didn't talk to her, but she was in the database, this 73-year-old woman from New Jersey who regretted stealing a candy bar from a store when she was like 10 years old. You know, so most people are good, and most people want to be good and feel bad when they're not good. I mean, the 5% who don't, they cause a lot of problems. And then also our connection regrets, and these are the biggest category. These are regrets about relationships, and typically what you have is you have a relationship, it was intact or should have been intact, and it comes apart. And a lot of times these relationships that come apart, the way they come apart is profoundly undramatic. They just kind of drift apart. And somebody wants to say something, somebody wants to reach out, they don't, because they think it's going to be awkward. They think the other side's not going to care. And so they wait. Then it feels more awkward. And they think the other side's going to care less. And they don't do anything. And these can be any kind of relationships among parents and kids, siblings, to some extent spouses, a little bit less on spouses and romantic partners. Huge numbers of regrets about friendships that drifted away and you didn't do anything, and then sometimes it's too late. And so when we look at these regrets, these 4 regrets all over the world, they operate as kind of a reverse image of what people, I think, want out of life. What do you want out of life? Foundational regrets. You want some stability. A good life has stability to it. It's not wobbly. It's not wobbly beneath your feet. Boldness regrets. We want to learn and grow. We want to do something with our life. We're not here forever. Human beings know that we all know we're going to die. And we don't think about that every day. We probably shouldn't think about that every day. But it's in some ways the backbeat of our lives. And people ask themselves, well, when am I going to do something? When am I going to step up? Moral regrets are about goodness, because a good life is being good. Good life is being virtuous. Good life is being true, just. And then connection regrets are about love. A good life is love. And it's like, and so many of our decisions in our life actually don't matter all that much, you know? And so, but some of them matter a lot. And so the decisions that are about these kinds of things, take very seriously, because if you screw it up, you're going to regret it. And everything else, just chill out, you know? And if you just think about regret in terms of decision making, you know, all of you, let's take Friday. Everybody in this room Friday, if we were to follow you around all day Friday, you probably made 100, 150 decisions on Friday. Right? It's Sunday now. And I would imagine that most of those decisions you made on Friday, you do not remember today, 48 hours later. But there are certain decisions and indecisions from a year ago, from 5 years ago, from 10 years ago, from 20 years ago, from 30 years ago, that not only do you remember them today, they bug you. That's a very strong signal, guys. You know, you got to pay attention to that. And so when we think about, to Monica's question about optimizing, when we think about things prospectively, we want to actually make really, really good decisions when it comes to building a foundation, when it comes to being bold and learning and growing, when it comes to doing the right thing, and when it comes to love. And the other things, they don't matter. And it's a hard thing for certain people to do, to say, a lot of decisions I make, I'm going to, what's called in psychological literature, satisfice. I'm going to satisfice. I'm not going to maximize, I'm just going to satisfice. And, you know, most decisions we make, they don't matter all that much. But some of them matter a heck of a lot.
Okay, I'm looking at your watch. It's
Yes.
1:25. We said we'd get you out of here by 1:30. I still want to go get you your babka. So I think it's time to thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me, yeah. Yeah, for sure. I'm sorry, say that again? Yeah. For this time,